In the Second World War, the Third Reich seemed unstoppable until a chain of mistaken decisions, from strategic arrogance to poor management of resources, was undermining its strength step by step. 9 errors, different in nature but lethal together, marked the path from overwhelming victories to total collapse, leaving a bitter lesson about how war is not always won by the one who strikes first, but by the one who knows how to resist and correct the course. When Hitler underestimated the Soviet Union. At dawn on the 22nd of June of 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the eastern border in an operation that, according to the conviction of Hitler and his high command, had to be resolved before winter fell upon the Russian plains. It was the greatest land invasion in history, christened with the code name Operation Barbarossa, and its objective was none other than to crush the Soviet giant in a lightning blow. The planning was based on a simple and at the same time dangerous assumption that Stalin's regime would collapse at the first impact, unable to resist the coordinated push of the Wehrmacht. In Berlin, an idea was repeated that seemed unquestionable to the Nazi strategists. The Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. The purge of the Red Army in 1937, in which Stalin had eliminated a good part of his most experienced generals, was interpreted as a military suicide. The Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940, with its disastrous beginnings for the Soviet forces, reinforced the impression of a clumsy army, poorly equipped and led by incompetence. In the Reich chancelleries, they spoke of a backward society, of a resigned peasantry, and of an industry incapable of sustaining a modern war effort. Ideology played its part. The racial contempt toward the Slavs led Hitler to completely underestimate their capacity for resistance. The first weeks seemed to confirm the prophecy. In a matter of days, the panzer divisions advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircled entire armies, and took prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. The magnitude of the pockets in Belarus and Ukraine was such that the Germans themselves were surprised. The roads, poorly paved or simple dirt tracks, were clogged with defeated Soviet columns, horse-drawn carts, and abandoned equipment. The myth of the invincibility of the Blitzkrieg grew. From the campaign headquarters, euphoric telegrams arrived. Goebbels, always attentive, amplified on the radio the image of an imminent collapse. In Hitler's private conversations with his generals, it was repeated that the campaign would be finished before the leaves fall. But reality, as so often, was hidden beneath the surface. The USSR was a country that could absorb blows of unimaginable violence and still reorganize. Its geography was a silent ally. Behind every captured line there were thousands of kilometers of territory, industrial cities ready to be dismantled and moved eastward beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. The Red Army, though wounded, learned quickly, adapting its tactics and replacing its commanders with a speed that the German intelligence services had not foreseen. And what for Hitler was unthinkable, for Stalin was an unquestionable order: resist at any cost, no matter the losses. One of the most serious errors in German planning was the disregard for logistics in such a vast theatre of operations. The same roads that had allowed the panzer divisions to advance at full speed became quagmires when the autumn rains arrived, slowing down the armored vehicles and breaking the trucks. The Soviet railway gauge, different from the European one, forced line after line to be rebuilt in order to supply the troops, a slow job that consumed resources and time. The German High Command had not foreseen that such a broad offensive would require supply chains crossing thousands of kilometers, with fuel, munitions, spare parts, and food traveling for days to reach the front. The underestimation also extended to the human front. In Hitler's mind, the population of the Soviet republics would rise up against the communist regime, greeting the Germans as liberators. There were isolated cases of collaborationism in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, but the brutality of the occupation, the mass executions, the confiscation of harvests, and the indiscriminate repression transformed any initial sympathy into a fierce resistance. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had not calculated that humiliation and terror could unite such a diverse people against a common enemy. The climate factor, turned into legend after the Napoleonic failure, was not taken seriously either in the initial phase of the invasion. The planners trusted in a victory before winter, so not enough warm uniforms nor equipment adapted for below-zero temperatures were sent. When the first snowfalls came in October, the weapons jammed, the engines would not start, and the soldiers frozen stiff improvised protection with blankets, newspapers, or garments captured from the enemy. Meanwhile, the Soviets, better adapted to the extreme conditions, counterattacked near Moscow, pushing the Germans into their first significant retreat. The collapse that Hitler expected not only did not occur, but the Soviet war economy reached levels of production that surprised foreign observers. The factories evacuated to the Urals and Siberia began to mass-produce T-34 tanks and fighter planes that equaled or surpassed their German counterparts. Stalin's centralized planning, although rigid, allowed resources to be allocated efficiently to sustain the war effort. Women and adolescents joined industrial and agricultural work, compensating for the absence of millions of men mobilized. The ideological divisions in the German High Command also played their part. Some generals, such as Heinz Guderian, warned of the need for a concentrated blow towards Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the country. Others, such as von Bock and von Leeb, preferred broader campaigns to destroy the Red Army in the field. Hitler ultimately opted for a dispersed approach. In the north, Leningrad; in the south, Ukraine and the Caucasus; in the center, Moscow. This strategic indecision diluted the strength of the attack and gave the Soviets the time they needed to regroup. In the rear, the German intelligence service was also not up to the magnitude of the operation. The Abwehr and the Fremde Heere Ost failed to correctly assess the depth of the Soviet reserves and their ability to mobilize new divisions from the most remote areas of the country. Each time a front collapsed, another seemed to emerge, reinforced and ready to counterattack. The myth of the last Soviet army was dismantled again and again during 1941 and 1942. The initial optimism turned into a race against time. Each week that passed without decisive victory increased the pressure on supply lines, the wear of equipment, and the fatigue of the troops. Propaganda continued speaking of advances, but the reality at the front was harsher. Positional battles, unexpected counterattacks, and an enemy that seemed to rise again with each blow. In Berlin, some officers were beginning to realize that the initial premise, the idea that the USSR was a fragile giant, had been a dangerous illusion, but by then the war machine was already too committed to turn back. Hitler's decision to divide the forces during the offensive against the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The vast plains of Ukraine and Belarus were filled with armored columns of prisoners and smoke from burning cities. On the maps of the German High Command, the arrows that represented the German advances spread like tentacles into the interior of the Soviet Union, covering thousands of kilometers in a few weeks. The original plan of Operation Barbarossa had divided the forces into three large groups: Army Group North, destined to advance toward Leningrad; Army Group South, toward Ukraine and the Caucasus; and Army Group Center, which was to head toward Moscow. On paper, everything was calculated, but as the offensive progressed, the question of what the priority objective should be began to generate tensions between the generals and the Führer. For many experienced commanders, Moscow was the heart of the Soviet Union. The capital not only had incalculable political and symbolic value, but it was also a key hub of railway transport and communications. Heinz Guderian, master of armored warfare, was convinced that a direct and rapid blow against Moscow before winter arrived could bring down the Soviet command structure and provoke a general collapse. Others, like Marshal Fedor von Bock, agreed that the opportunity to deliver the decisive blow was right in front of them and that any diversion would be a fatal mistake. Hitler, however, saw the war in the East not only as a military campaign but as an ideological and economic crusade. In his mind, Ukrainian wheat and Caucasian oil were as important as the fall of the enemy capital. At the beginning of August, convinced that Soviet resistance in the south offered an opportunity to destroy a large number of enemy armies, he ordered part of the forces of Army Group Center, including Guderian's armored units, to divert toward Ukraine to encircle the Soviet forces in the Kiev region. It was a decision that in practice stopped the direct advance toward Moscow for crucial weeks. The operation in Ukraine was, from the tactical point of view, a triumph. The encirclement of Kiev in September of 1941 resulted in the capture of more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers, one of the greatest encirclements in military history. The photos of endless columns of prisoners fed German propaganda and reinforced the belief that the enemy was on the verge of defeat. However, every day spent in the south was a day the Soviet machine gained to fortify Moscow, relocate factories, and bring reinforcements from the depths of the country. While the German divisions fought in Ukraine, the autumn rains began to transform the dirt roads into quagmires. The famous Rasputitsa, the mud season that turned the terrain into a thick, impassable sea, was beginning to appear. The tanks got stuck, the trucks were trapped, and the characteristic speed of the blitzkrieg was reduced to an exhausting advance of a few kilometers per day. When the offensive toward Moscow finally resumed in October, the window for a rapid attack had narrowed dangerously. At the other end of the front, Hitler had also yielded to the temptation to disperse efforts in the north. The siege of Leningrad, begun in September, absorbed troops, artillery, and supplies that could have reinforced the central thrust. The city, symbol of the October Revolution, was a target of high propaganda value for the Nazi regime, and Hitler was determined to erase it from the map. But, as in the south, the campaign turned into a war of attrition, immobilizing valuable resources without producing a decisive advance. The consequence of these decisions was that Army Group Center, which was to be the spearhead toward Moscow, advanced late and with reduced forces. When the final offensive against the capital, Operation Typhoon, began in October of 1941, time was already against them. The enemy, far from being broken, had organized defenses in depth with fortified lines, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles along dozens of kilometers. The early arrival of winter complicated operations even more. The temperatures plunged, and the German troops, without adequate clothing or cold weather equipment, suffered constant frostbite and breakdowns. In the reports that reached headquarters, the German generals warned that the advance towards Moscow was becoming a race of endurance rather than a lightning blow. The Red Army, reinforced by Siberian divisions brought from the Far East thanks to intelligence confirming that Japan would not attack from the east, counterattacked in December, pushing the Germans tens of kilometers back. The dream of taking the capital before the end of the year vanished under the snow. Many military historians have pointed out that Hitler's decision to divide the forces in 1941 was a monumental strategic error. Not because the victories in Kiev or the siege of Leningrad lacked importance, but because the cost in time and resources prevented taking advantage of the opportunity to seize Moscow before the weather and the Soviet reorganization closed the window. The memoirs of Guderian and other commanders record their frustration before a Führer who, distrustful of the judgment of his generals, intervened directly in operational planning, moving armies on the map as if they were chess pieces. Behind these decisions was also the weight of ideology. Hitler did not conceive war as a series of strictly sequenced military objectives, but as a set of simultaneous operations to annihilate the enemy on all planes: political, economic, demographic. Hence the conquest of Ukraine, with its agricultural value, and the control of the Caucasus, with its promise of oil, competed in his mind with the fall of Moscow. The result was an excessively broad front, where the effort was diluted and the supply lines were stretched to the limit. The Wehrmacht, designed for rapid and concentrated campaigns, found itself fighting in a theater of war that demanded prolonged resistance and titanic logistical coordination. The dispersion of forces not only slowed the offensive, but also gave the Soviets something they could not buy with gold: time. Time to mobilize millions of new recruits, to strengthen the defenses, and to transform the industry of the East into a war machine that would produce without rest during the following years. And so, what in August of 1941 seemed like a campaign about to culminate in victory, in December had turned into a long and brutal war, with an enemy stronger than ever and a winter that had come to stay, declaring war on the United States. On the 11th of December of 1941, in the solemn hall of the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler rose before an audience of Nazi dignitaries, uniformed officers, and party members to announce that Germany was declaring war on the United States of America. Outside, Berlin was covered by the winter cold and by the sensation, increasingly palpable, that the conflict was expanding beyond any initial calculation. 4 days earlier, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, striking the United States Pacific Fleet and prompting Franklin D. Roosevelt to ask Congress to declare war on the Japanese Empire. In theory, Germany was not obligated to intervene. The Tripartite Pact, signed in September of 1940, stipulated mutual assistance in case one of the Axis powers was attacked, not if it initiated an offensive. However, Hitler decided to take the step. The decision surprised even some of his closest collaborators. From the German perspective, the United States was an industrial giant that was not advisable to provoke before having defeated the Soviet Union or secured dominance over Europe. Admiral Erich Raeder, himself head of the Kriegsmarine, knew that the German Navy was not in a position to face the powerful United States fleet in open sea. The submarine forces, although effective, lacked the numbers necessary for a total blockade of North Atlantic traffic, and German shipbuilding could not match the pace of United States production. Hitler, however, did not see the situation with the same eyes as his naval advisors. Convinced that Roosevelt was already seeking any pretext to enter into war against the Reich, he believed that conflict with the United States was inevitable. The previous measures of the United States government, such as the Lend-Lease Act, which supplied Great Britain and the USSR with weapons, fuel, and food, were already considered by Hitler as acts of covert aggression. The naval incidents in the Atlantic, such as the attack on the destroyer USS Greer in September of 1941, had further strained the relationship. For the Führer, the formal declaration of war only acknowledged a reality that, according to him, already existed. The speech of the 11th of December was a mixture of ideological and geopolitical accusations. Hitler presented Roosevelt as an instigator who had pushed Japan into the conflict and who sought to destroy Germany as part of a global conspiracy led in his usual rhetoric by international Jewry. In the dictator's mind, formally uniting Germany and Japan against a common enemy could offer strategic advantages. Japan could attack the British colonies in Asia, distracting resources that otherwise would be employed in Europe, and, with luck, force the United States to divide its attention between the Pacific and the Atlantic. In Washington, the news was received with a mixture of relief and determination. Until that moment, Roosevelt had had to maneuver politically so that public opinion, largely isolationist, would accept the idea that the United States had to become directly involved in the war against Germany. The attack on Pearl Harbor had cleared the doubts regarding Japan, but Hitler, by declaring war, gave Roosevelt the justification he needed to bring the conflict to the European stage without the need for long discussions in Congress. On the 11th of December, the very day of Hitler's announcement, the United States Congress responded by declaring war on Germany and Italy unanimously. At sea, the news opened a new phase of the submarine war. The High Command of the Kriegsmarine, under the direction of Karl Dönitz, launched the so-called Second Battle of the Atlantic, with a direct submarine offensive against the east coast of the United States. Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat, brought the U-boats to attack merchant ships and oil tankers off cities like New York, where the silhouette of the ships stood out against the illuminated horizon. During the first months of 1942, the United States' losses were enormous. However, the country possessed practically inexhaustible resources and a rapid capacity for adaptation. The coastal escorts, the convoy system, and the accelerated expansion of shipbuilding soon reduced the effectiveness of the German attacks. Meanwhile, the official entry of the United States into the war altered the global balance. United States industrial power, until then employed in supporting the Allies indirectly, now turned toward a total mobilization. The factories of Detroit produced tanks and trucks in series. The shipyards of the coast built ships at an unprecedented pace. Military aviation grew to levels that neither the Luftwaffe nor the Imperial Japanese Navy could equal in the long term. Germany, which was already fighting on a gigantic eastern front and maintaining campaigns in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, would have to face an adversary that could sustain operations on a planetary scale. On the diplomatic front, Hitler's decision also had far-reaching consequences. The declaration of war formally united the main Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, in a pact of cooperation that transcended their ideological differences. The Arcadia Conference, held in Washington a few weeks later, laid the foundations for a coordinated strategy in all theaters of operations. For the first time, the conflict acquired a truly global character, with interconnected fronts from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific. Within Germany, the news was received with a mixture of confidence and resignation. Goebbels' propaganda presented the entry into war against the United States as a logical and necessary step to defend the Reich from Anglo-American aggression. The newspapers assured that the German naval force, combined with the Japanese, could close the circle over the Allies. However, among some high-ranking officers, whispers of unease were beginning to be heard. The strategists who knew closely the magnitude of the American economy knew that the Reich had taken on an adversary capable of producing more planes, more ships, and more tanks than any other country in the world. The decision was not the result of a broad debate, but rather of Hitler's personal conviction, fueled by his particular reading of the international situation. It was in part a gesture of defiance and, in part, an ideological gamble. Hitler did not conceive of a limited war nor of an enemy with whom he could coexist. For him, the confrontation with the United States was part of a broader struggle for global domination, a struggle that, he believed, had to be fought before the Reich was cornered. His miscalculation was to believe that the war against such a distant and powerful adversary could be won while the Eastern Front had not yet been resolved. The Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, with France defeated and its troops parading through the Champs-Élysées, Germany seemed master of Western Europe. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated in Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, and France that the Blitzkrieg was more than a military concept. It was a devastating weapon capable of bringing down in weeks armies that on paper seemed formidable. Only one active enemy remained in the West, Great Britain. And at least from Hitler's perspective, its geographic isolation made it a target that, with the proper push, could be neutralized before the United States intervened or resistance within the British Empire consolidated. But there was a natural obstacle that no tank could cross: the English Channel. To invade the British Isles, the projected Operation Sea Lion, Germany needed to dominate the air over the Channel and over southern England. Without that air supremacy, any invasion fleet would be at the mercy of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, RAF. The weight of the task would fall upon the Luftwaffe, directed by Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal, First World War hero and Hitler's trusted man. In theory, the Luftwaffe was well equipped for the task. It had Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, fast and maneuverable, and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers whose precision had terrified enemies in earlier campaigns. It also had medium bombers Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Du-17 for longer-range attacks. The initial idea was simple: destroy the RAF in the air and on the ground, pulverize its airfields, radar stations and command centers, and thus open the way for the landing. In practice, the task would prove much more complex. The battle began in earnest in July of 1940 with attacks against convoys in the Channel and radar stations on the southern coast. At first, the Germans were surprised by the British resistance. The air defense system devised by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a network of radars, ground observers, command centers and coordinated fighters, allowed the RAF to concentrate its forces at the exact point and at the right moment. This compensated for the initial numerical inferiority and forced the Luftwaffe to fight under less favorable conditions than it had anticipated. In August, Göring intensified the offensive against RAF airfields in the southeast in an attempt to destroy its fighters on the ground. The pressure was enormous. The British squadrons were forced to fly several missions a day, their pilots accumulated fatigue, and the casualties were constant. However, the British aircraft industry, protected from the heaviest bombings, managed to replace losses at a surprising pace, and the pilots shot down over British territory could return to fly if they survived. The Germans, on the other hand, lost experienced men who could not be replaced with the same speed. The turning point came at the beginning of September. After a British bombing of Berlin, Hitler ordered Göring to change the focus. Instead of continuing to hammer airfields and radar stations, the Luftwaffe was to concentrate on massive attacks against London and other cities. It was a decision with an emotional component. Hitler wanted to punish the British for daring to strike the capital of the Reich. But strategically, it was a mistake. By diverting the pressure from the air bases, the RAF was able to repair runways, reorganize squadrons, and recover its strength. The bombings of London, which would later be known as the Blitz, sought to break civilian morale and force the British government to negotiate. The image of the city in flames, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, was shocking, but it didn't achieve the desired effect. The British population, far from surrendering, closed ranks behind Churchill. In the air, the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters kept appearing again and again to intercept the German bombers, inflicting increasingly heavy losses. The Luftwaffe also faced a technical problem. Its medium bombers lacked the range and the explosive payload of the heavy bombers that would have been ideal for the task. This forced them to operate at the limit of their autonomy, with Bf 109 fighter escorts that had to return before completing the mission, leaving the bombers vulnerable. The Stukas, so effective in France and Poland, proved too slow and fragile against the British defense and were withdrawn from the main front after suffering catastrophic losses. The wear began to be noticed. The Luftwaffe was not designed for prolonged campaigns of strategic bombing, and the rotation of units could not compensate for the losses of veteran pilots. At the same time, the British defense system continued to function effectively, detecting and responding to each incursion. The combination of radar, command coordination, and the courage of the pilots allowed the RAF to maintain control of the airspace over its territory. By October, the autumn weather and the growing casualties forced Göring to reduce the pace of daytime operations, transferring much of the effort to nighttime bombings. This relieved the cities during the day, but it also meant that the Luftwaffe had failed in its main objective, to eliminate the RAF as an effective combat force. Without air supremacy, Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed and, in practice, abandoned. The failure had consequences beyond the British coasts. For the first time in the war, Nazi Germany had attempted a decisive offensive and had not achieved its objective. In the corridors of the German Air Ministry, some officers acknowledged that British resilience had been underestimated and the destructive power of their own bombers overestimated. The decision to change the target of the attacks at the critical moment was seen, even by German commanders, as a strategic error that gifted time to the enemy. While London burned at night and its inhabitants sought refuge in the underground stations, the British shipyards and factories continued producing planes, munitions and ships at an increasing pace. And abroad, especially in the United States, the image of a Great Britain resisting alone fueled popular support for the Allied cause, preparing the ground for a future American entry into the European conflict. The mistake of losing the Mediterranean. When Italy entered the war in June of 1940, Mussolini dreamed of turning the Mediterranean into a modern Mare Nostrum, a zone controlled by the Axis that would recall the greatness of the Roman Empire. In Berlin, Hitler saw the region as a secondary theatre. The true destiny of the Reich lay in the east, in the conquest of living space in the Soviet Union. However, war rarely follows the mental maps of dictators. What began as a poorly planned Italian campaign would end up dragging Germany into a complex front, full of strategic opportunities that never fully materialized. The Mediterranean was more than a sea. It was the artery that connected the United Kingdom with its Eastern Empire, Egypt, India, Australia, and the colonies in Asia. Through the Suez Canal passed men, oil, weapons, and vital supplies to sustain the war in North Africa and the Middle East. If the Axis managed to cut that route, Great Britain would have to divert its trade around South Africa, lengthening the journey by thousands of kilometers and forcing a titanic logistical effort. In theory, a coordinated German-Italian blow against Egypt and the Canal could change the balance of the war. But theory stumbled against reality. Mussolini, impatient to demonstrate that Italy could achieve victories without Germany's help, ordered in September of 1940 the invasion of Egypt from Libya. The operation, improvised and poorly supplied, quickly stalled before the much better organized British forces. In December, the British counterattacked and, in a matter of weeks, pushed the Italian troops more than 800 kilometers westward, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. The humiliation was such that Mussolini had to ask Hitler for aid. Thus entered the scene General Erwin Rommel, sent in February of 1941 with the Afrika Korps to stabilize the front. Rommel, bold and charismatic, managed not only to contain the British, but to push them back again toward the Egyptian border. His style of lightning warfare, even in the desert, astonished both allies and enemies. However, from the very first day, his campaign was marked by a chronic shortage: supply. The Libyan ports of Tripoli and Benghazi were too small to receive all the necessary material, and the convoys from Italy suffered constant attacks from the Royal Navy and from British aviation based in Malta. Malta, a rock in the middle of the central Mediterranean, became a thorn stuck in the Axis's side. From there, British aircraft and submarines intercepted the convoys carrying fuel, munitions, and spare parts to Rommel. On several occasions, the Germans and Italians planned to invade the island, Operation Hercules. But Hitler never gave real priority to the mission. He feared risking paratroopers and air resources that he considered necessary on the Eastern Front. That decision, apparently minor, had a cumulative effect. Each tank Rommel lost was harder to replace. Each advance was limited by the fuel available. While Rommel fought his battles in the dunes, another front opened in the eastern Mediterranean. In April of 1941, The German intervention in Greece and Crete delayed even more any effort to consolidate North Africa. The Balkan campaign, motivated in part by the Italian military blunders in Greece, absorbed troops and delayed Operation Barbarossa by several weeks. Again, a theatre that was supposed to be secondary ended up influencing the main one. In Egypt, the British, reinforced by Commonwealth troops, managed to recover again and again. The war in the desert became a series of offensives and counter-offensives: Tobruk, Sollum, El Alamein. Each victory of Rommel was limited by the impossibility of exploiting success beyond what his supply lines allowed. In Berlin, Hitler admired the desert fox, but was not willing to give him everything he asked for. For him, Africa was a secondary board, a place to keep the British occupied, but not the stage where the fate of the Reich would be decided. Hitler's vision contrasted with that of some of his own generals, and with that of his Italian allies, who understood that control of the Mediterranean could be a mortal blow to Great Britain. If the Axis had taken Malta, pushed to the Suez Canal, and connected with the Japanese forces advancing through Southeast Asia, London would have lost its bridge with Asia, but those pieces never came together. Japan, focused on its war in the Pacific, did not coordinate operations with Germany in the Middle East. The Axis, instead of a global pincer, functioned as a series of isolated campaigns. By 1942, the tide was beginning to turn. The British forces, now supplied consistently thanks to convoys that skirted the Mediterranean or went around Africa, received the arrival of American equipment and vehicles through the Lend-Lease Act. The entry of the United States into the war multiplied the flow of material. In the air, the balance was also tilting. The more modern Spitfire fighters and, later, the American P-40 and P-51 began to dominate the skies over the desert. The final blow to the Axis aspirations in the Mediterranean came with the Second Battle of El Alamein in October-November of 1942. There, the British General Bernard Montgomery, with overwhelming superiority in men, tanks and artillery, forced Rommel to retreat. Weeks later, in November, the Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, opening a second front in North Africa that trapped the Afrika Korps between two fires. The campaign would end in May of 1943 with the surrender of more than 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia. The inability to consolidate the Mediterranean was not due to a single defeat, but to a chain of political and strategic decisions that reduced the priority of a front that, well exploited, could have changed the dynamics of the war. The Mediterranean, which for Italy was a vital objective and for Great Britain a matter of survival, for Hitler was always a stage subordinate to his obsession with the East. When the German factories could no longer cope, in the early years of the war, the German military machine seemed like a perfectly oiled gear. Tanks crossing borders at unexpected speed, fighters and bombers dominating the skies, submarines sinking entire convoys in the Atlantic. But beneath that image of efficiency, there was a reality that, over time, would become a structural problem. Germany was trying to produce everything at once, everywhere, without a unified industrial strategy that responded to the real needs of the front. The Reich was not, like the United States or the Soviet Union, a country with practically inexhaustible resources. The Lightning War, which had been so successful in Poland or France, was designed precisely to avoid a prolonged conflict that would demand a colossal industrial effort. Hitler and his high command knew that Germany depended on imported raw materials, oil, rubber, certain metals, and that its industry could not compete in volume with the Allied powers if the war dragged on. However, from 1941 onward, and especially after the entry of the United States into the conflict, the Reich became entangled in a production race for which it was not prepared. One of the most visible problems was the dispersion of efforts. Instead of concentrating on a few standardized and mass-produced models, The German industry maintained in parallel a wide variety of tanks, planes, and weapons, each with variants, modifications, and its own logistical requirements. In the skies, for example, the Luftwaffe operated Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters, He-111, Ju-88, Du-17, Ju-87, Me-410 bombers. Each model required specific spare parts, specialized training, and separate supply chains. The same occurred with tanks, Panzer III, Panzer IV, Tiger, Panther, all coexisting, each with its own maintenance and production needs, and with a high consumption of time and resources in manufacturing. Hitler's obsession with the so-called miracle weapons made the panorama even more complicated. Projects such as the Messerschmitt Me-262, the V-2 rocket, or the super-tanks Maus and E-100 absorbed valuable resources that, had they been directed to proven equipment already in production, could have reinforced the troops in combat. These innovations, although technically impressive, arrived late, in insufficient quantities, and without real capacity to alter the course of the war. Industry was forced to develop experimental programs simultaneously while trying to cover the urgent needs of munitions, fuel, and spare parts. Oil was perhaps the most evident Achilles' heel. Germany depended largely on Romanian oil from Ploiesti and on synthetic production from coal. Each liter of fuel had to be distributed among the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. Armored offensives, air operations, and the submarine war competed for the same resource, and as the Allies intensified their bombings of refineries and synthetic fuel plants, the shortage became critical. Immobilized tanks, planes unable to train their pilots, submarines reducing their patrols. The war machine was beginning to lose mobility. The Luftwaffe, designed for short campaigns and rapid offensives, had to adapt to a defensive war, protecting German airspace from Allied bombings day and night. This required more fighters and trained pilots, but the training program was shortened to send aviators to the front as soon as possible. The quality of the pilots dropped and the losses grew. At the same time, the factories suffered constant interruptions from air raids, which forced production to be dispersed into smaller and less efficient workshops to avoid complete destruction. What was gained in security was lost in volume and coordination. The Kriegsmarine was not spared from the problem either. The production of U-boats, which had begun on a large scale in 1940, did not reach the pace necessary to compensate for the losses suffered in the Atlantic. The construction program of Type 21st submarines, technologically advanced, absorbed enormous resources and arrived too late to change the course of the submarine war. Instead of prioritizing proven models and mass-producing them, the Navy became entangled in new designs that required more time and more materials. On land, the Wehrmacht suffered a similar problem with light weapons and artillery. The multiple variants of rifles, machine guns, and anti-tank guns hindered mass production and the supply of standardized ammunition. Moreover, the obsession with perfecting each weapon before producing it on a large scale meant that many arrived late at the front or in minimal quantities. Meanwhile, the Allies adopted a more pragmatic approach, mass-producing reliable models, even if they were not the most technologically advanced. Starting in 1943, with the war already clearly tilting towards the Allies, Albert Speer assumed the Ministry of Armaments and tried to rationalize production. The number of models was reduced, work was reorganized, and improvements in efficiency were introduced. The results were remarkable. Despite the bombings and the loss of industrial territories, German production of tanks, planes, and weapons reached its peak in 1944. However, this rationalization came too late and could not compensate for the loss of strategic resources and the military pressure on all fronts. Another factor that overloaded industrial capacity was the multiplicity of open fronts. Since 1941, Germany fought simultaneously in the east against the USSR in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, and after 1944 in occupied France itself. Each front required adapted equipment: tanks for the steppes, light vehicles for the desert, submarines for the Atlantic, coastal defences in the English Channel. This forced production to be divided and to maintain different inventories, multiplying logistical complexity. The massive use of forced labour in the factories coming from the occupied territories added another level of difficulty. Although the number of available workers increased, the lack of motivation, sabotage, and harsh working conditions affected the quality and speed of production. In some cases, defective parts or poorly performed assemblies caused failures on the battlefield. Overall, the overstretching of the production line and resources created a vicious circle: too many models, too many fronts, too many simultaneous projects, all with limited resources and under constant pressure. Germany tried to fight as if it were a power with unlimited industrial capacity, but the reality was that each new design, each new front, and each new offensive drained fuel, steel, rubber, and, above all, time that couldn't be recovered. The loss of Stalingrad. The summer of 1942 found the Wehrmacht still holding the initiative on the Eastern Front, but already far from the euphoria of the previous year. Operation Barbarossa had not brought down the Soviet Union, and Moscow remained in enemy hands. Hitler, convinced that a new blow could break Soviet resistance, drew up an ambitious plan: advance south, seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, and in passing conquer Stalingrad, a city whose very name was itself a political and propaganda challenge. The offensive, christened Operation Blue, began in June of 1942 with a massive deployment of troops, tanks, and planes. The main objective was oil. Without it, the German war machine could not keep functioning. However, in Hitler's mental map, Stalingrad appeared as a double prize. Not only would it control a strategic hub on the Volga River, vital for Soviet transport, but it would also deliver a moral blow by capturing the city that bore his enemy's name. What began as a secondary objective soon turned into an obsession. In August, the German vanguards reached the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe, under orders to devastate the place before the ground assault, launched a massive bombing that reduced entire neighborhoods to ruins. Paradoxically, the ruins became a natural defense for the Soviets. The rubble-filled streets blocked the advance of the tanks, and each destroyed building could be turned into an improvised fortress. Urban combat, for which the Wehrmacht was not trained, turned into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and ambushes. General Friedrich Paulus, in command of the Sixth Army, expected a brief battle. The initial reports suggested that the resistance would soon collapse, but Stalingrad was no ordinary city. Stalin had ordered it defended at all costs, and General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Soviet Army, turned every street, every factory, and every basement into a battlefield. The fighting unfolded at such short distances that in some sectors, soldiers from both sides were separated only by a wall. The front, more than a line, was a mosaic of mixed positions. In this setting, German superiority in maneuver and heavy weaponry was diluted. The tanks, designed for battles in open country, were trapped among rubble and snipers. Heavy artillery had difficulty identifying clear targets, and each shot could destroy an objective of little tactical value. The Soviets, on the other hand, made the most of their knowledge of the terrain, infiltrating reinforcements and supplies at night, crossing the Volga under enemy fire. One of the gravest errors was the lack of tactical flexibility. Paulus followed strict orders to take the city at all costs, even when conditions favored the defender. Instead of surrounding Stalingrad and isolating it, a strategy some officers recommended, a prolonged frontal assault was chosen, consuming men and material at an unsustainable rate. Casualties grew day after day, and each new German offensive ran into an equally fierce Soviet counteroffensive. Hitler constantly intervened in operational decisions. From his headquarters, he dictated orders that ignored the reality at the front. When the Sixth Army began to show signs of exhaustion, instead of allowing an orderly withdrawal or a change of tactics, the Führer insisted that the city had to be conquered completely. Symbolic value had overtaken strategic value, and the sacrifice of resources in Stalingrad weakened other sectors of the southern front. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command prepared its own move, taking advantage of the fact that the Sixth Army was bogged down in street-by-street combat. The Soviets concentrated forces to the north and south of the city. In mid-November of 1942, they launched Operation Uranus, an encircling blow that did not attack the center of Stalingrad, but the weak Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian positions that guarded the German flanks. The advance was rapid and devastating. In a few days, the Soviet pincers closed, trapping more than 250,000 German and Allied soldiers inside a pocket. Here, the second great tactical mistake occurred. When it became clear that the Sixth Army was surrounded, several officers, including Marshal Erich von Manstein, advised Hitler to authorize an immediate breakout westward before the encirclement was consolidated. But the Führer, clinging to the idea that Stalingrad had to be held, ordered Paulus to resist while waiting for a rescue. The relief operation, named Winter Storm, advanced from the southwest in December, but it did not succeed in opening a corridor. The winter battles, the frozen terrain, and the lack of sufficient forces stopped the attempt. Inside the encirclement, conditions were rapidly deteriorating. The air supply promised by Göring turned out to be a chimera. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport planes nor the capacity to fly in the extreme weather conditions. The soldiers rationed food to minimal amounts, ammunition was scarce, and casualties from frostbite increased. The wounded piled up in improvised hospitals died for lack of medicine and heating. Horses were slaughtered to feed the troops. Afterwards, any animal that could serve as food disappeared. In January of 1943, the Soviet forces launched the final offensive. The German positions shrank day by day, and the resistance became a series of isolated points surrounded by a sea of Soviet uniforms. Paulus, promoted by Hitler to field marshal with the insinuation that he should commit suicide before surrendering, decided to give himself up on the 31st of January. On the 2nd of February, the last units in the north of the city capitulated. Of the hundreds of thousands of men who had entered Stalingrad, only a fraction would return to Germany after years of captivity. The loss of the Colossi, the defeat at Kursk. The summer of 1943 began with a strange calm on the Eastern Front. After the disaster of Stalingrad and the retreat in the Caucasus, the Wehrmacht had managed to stabilize the line in the spring, but only at the cost of enormous human and material losses. In the center of the operational map, a bulge of the Soviet front extended westward, the Kursk salient. In Berlin, Hitler saw it as an opportunity to regain the initiative. If the German forces managed to encircle and destroy the Soviet armies within that protrusion, they could restore morale, shorten the front, and perhaps delay the offensive that everyone sensed Moscow was preparing. The operation planned for that blow received the code name Citadel. The plan was simple on paper, a pincer attack with Army Group Center advancing from the north and Army Group South from the south, closing the encirclement around Kursk. For this, the greatest concentration of German armored forces of the war would be assembled. More than 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the new Panzer V Panther and the colossal Panzer VI Tiger. The idea was that the firepower and armor of these new models would crush any resistance, but from the very beginning, the calendar began to work against them. Hitler, obsessed that the new tanks be completely ready for the offensive, delayed the planned start in May until early July. Each passing week gave the Soviets more time to fortify the salient, and Stalin, informed by his intelligence, including data provided by Richard Sorge's spy network, knew exactly what was coming. He ordered the Kursk salient transformed into a gigantic defensive field. Trenches, barbed wire, minefields, bunkers, anti-tank lines, all arranged in depth for more than 300 kilometers. In total, the Red Army dug a network that looked more like a medieval fortress spread across the steppe than a simple sector of the front. On the 5th of July of 1943, after a brief and ineffective aerial and artillery bombardment, the German offensive began. In the north, General Model's forces advanced slowly against defenses that seemed endless. In the south, General Hoth's troops and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser managed to penetrate more deeply but at a very high cost. Each meter of conquered ground required clearing minefields, enduring anti-tank ambushes and withstanding constant counterattacks. Mobility, the essence of German armored warfare, was suffocated by terrain prepared to stop precisely that type of advance. The new tanks, in which Hitler had placed so many hopes, showed their limitations. The Panthers, powerful in theory, suffered serious mechanical problems, defective clutches, engine fires, transmission failures. Many were put out of action without having fired a single shot. The Tigers, with their imposing armor and long-range cannon, were lethal in open country, but their small number and slowness made them vulnerable to Soviet mobility and the sheer saturation of targets. Against them, the Red Army deployed thousands of T-34s, lighter, easier to repair, and perfectly adapted to the terrain. The battle reached its climax in the south, near the small locality of Prokhorovka, on the 12th of July. There, in a stretch of rolling, dusty terrain, hundreds of tanks clashed in one of the greatest armored battles in history. The collision was brutal, at distances so short that in many cases the projectiles pierced the enemy's armor without the need for precise aiming. The sight of dozens of burning tanks, trapped crews, and black smoke rising to the sky became the symbol of the clash of titans that was Kursk. Although the Germans inflicted heavy losses, they failed to break the line or open the road to Kursk. At the same time, the strategic situation worsened for the Reich. On the very 12th of July, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the Orel salient, forcing Army Group Center onto the defensive. Days later, the news of the Allied landing in Sicily reached Hitler's desk, who decided to withdraw armored units from the Eastern Front to reinforce Italy. The German offensive at Kursk was officially halted on the 16th of July, without having achieved its objectives. The effort of months of preparation and resource accumulation had vanished in less than 2 weeks. The wear for the Wehrmacht was enormous. The losses in armored vehicles, many impossible to replace quickly, and the loss of veteran crews weakened the German offensive capacity for the rest of the war. Kursk was the last great German offensive in the east. From then on, the initiative passed definitively into Soviet hands, who would launch a series of uninterrupted offensives until reaching Berlin. One of the aspects most discussed by historians is the missed opportunity before the Soviets completed their defenses. If the offensive had been launched in May, as several generals proposed, perhaps the fortifications would have been less formidable. But Hitler's insistence on waiting until the Panthers and Tigers were available, and in some cases his desire to test them in combat as a demonstration of power, gave the enemy the necessary time to prepare the trap. The result was a battle where German tactics, based on mobility and surprise, were replaced by a frontal assault against a wall of steel and fire. The conception of total war that dragged disaster. The notion of total war had been officially proclaimed by Joseph Goebbels in his famous speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin in February of 1943, when there was still hope of reversing the course of the conflict. But what at that moment sounded like national mobilization, like using every resource for the war effort, turned into a spiral of limitless sacrifice, in which human and material resources were exhausted at a speed the country could not replenish. Germany, which already in 1939 had entered the war with limited reserves of raw materials, now had to defend a front that stretched from Norway to Hungary, passing through Italy and the Reich's own territory. The most immediate problem was the replacement of human losses. On the Eastern Front, casualties were counted in the hundreds of thousands every few months. The recruitment machinery began to empty the Wehrmacht's reserves, calling up 16- and 17-year-old teenagers and men over 50 who had fought in the First World War. The Volkssturm, a militia created in October of 1944, gathered anyone who could hold a rifle: office workers, students, laborers, and even the partially disabled. Armed many times with old rifles or improvised weapons, they were sent to stop Soviet and United States armored divisions with the same rhetoric as always: resist because surrender was not an option. At the same time, the production of armaments, though still impressive in absolute numbers, began to suffer the weight of the war in the Reich itself. The Allied bombings against industrial centers such as Essen, Hamburg, or Berlin destroyed entire factories, and the dispersal of production into small workshops to make it harder to locate reduced efficiency. Trains, vital for transporting material, operated with networks increasingly damaged by air attacks and sabotage from the resistance in the occupied countries. The loss of the mining basins and oil wells occupied in previous years worsened the collapse. Synthetic fuel produced from coal was not enough to supply even a fraction of the Luftwaffe or the armored units. At the tactical level, Hitler's insistence on holding every meter of ground without allowing strategic withdrawals multiplied losses. Cities and positions of little military value became fortresses where units entrenched themselves until they were destroyed or completely captured. The order of not yielding a step meant that entire divisions were trapped, with no possibility of retreating and reorganizing, which accelerated the bleeding of troops. The result was an army increasingly fragmented, with improvised formations that lacked cohesion and experience. In the air, the Luftwaffe was reduced to a desperate defensive role. The veteran pilots, who in the early years accumulated dozens of victories, had fallen or were exhausted. The new pilots arrived at the front with barely a few hours of real flight training, and many did not survive their first mission. On land, the use of heavy tanks such as the Tigers or Panthers remained impressive in terms of firepower, but their limited production and high fuel consumption made them scarce assets, often lost to breakdowns or lack of logistics before falling in combat. Propaganda continued to promise miracle weapons capable of changing the course. The Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, new generation submarines. However, none of these innovations could be produced in sufficient quantities or arrive in time to compensate for the reality. Germany was fighting adversaries who surpassed the Reich in men, material, and industrial capacity by overwhelming margins. Faith in these projects, encouraged by Hitler and Goebbels, prolonged the illusion that defeat was not inevitable, delaying political or military decisions that could have reduced the magnitude of the catastrophe. On the home front, the civilian population endured extreme privations. The ruined cities housed thousands of internal refugees, food rations were reduced to the essentials, and public transport barely functioned. Even so, the regime maintained discipline through the Gestapo and the absolute control of the media, punishing any sign of defeatism. Fear and indoctrination prevented the emergence of an internal movement capable of forcing a change of course. In December of 1944, the last offensive attempt in the West, the Battle of the Ardennes, consumed reserves that Germany could not afford to lose. Although it initially managed to surprise the Allies and cause setbacks, the counteroffensive failed in a matter of weeks. What remained afterwards was an exhausted Reich, defended by improvised lines and poorly equipped garrisons. In the east, the Soviet offensive of January of 1945 swept away in days what was left of the defense in Poland and opened the way to the Oder. Even when the Allied troops were crossing the Rhine and the Soviets were at the gates of Berlin, Hitler and his circle continued talking about resisting until the last cartridge. The total war had ceased to be a concept of mobilization and had become an empty slogan that justified the total destruction of the country rather than accepting surrender. Divisions formed by remnants of units, Volkssturm, and what was left of the Wehrmacht were thrown into hopeless combat, often without adequate weapons, simply to delay the enemy's advance by a few hours.